Welcome everyone to the Bonner Report. This is the inaugural video podcast of the Bonner Report, famous and well-known to all Substack subscribers, no doubt. And we are here live right now with George Thomas, whose pen name is Quintus Curtius. And he is a translator of the classics. He's a lawyer, all-round stand-up guy. Why don't we start by discussing that name, Quintus Curtius? Who was he? Why is he important to you?
Well, thank you for having me, Dr. Bonner. I wish I could tell you that there was some deep significance behind the use of that name, but he was a Roman historian, most famous for his history of Alexander, a historical account of the campaigns and life of Alexander the Great. But really, he has no significance to me at all, frankly. Back when I first started writing online, it was a habit, and I think maybe a trend in 2013, 2012 to adopt pen names and monikers like that. And I did that. I just looked over at my bookshelf and I happened to see it there. So that became the name. And once you go down those roads, it's kind of hard to break away from it. So there it is. It doesn't really have any emotional significance to me at all.
Well, I think it's a great name. And of course, as you say, he was a historian of Alexander, and he wrote in Latin. He's, of course, very obviously he has a Latin name. So you are also you're a classicist. You have translated. I know that I have your translation from the Sallusts Jugurthan War. But what else have you done?
Well, the first translation that I did was a very minor work of Cicero in 2015, Stoic Paradoxes, and that was followed a year later by On Duties, and then the year after that On Moral Ends, then Cornelius Nepos' Lives of the Great Commanders. In 2021 was Tusculan Disputations, another treatise of Cicero's. I forgot Sallust's, the Catiline conspiracy and the War of Jugurtha.
Yeah.
And hopefully coming in August or September, it will be Cicero's On the Nature of the Gods. So there's been a number of them. And what prompted me to do that was I felt like the existing translations were simply not really accessible to the general reader in the way that I felt like students and the average reader probably needed them to be.
So I think it's interesting. I mean, from we should probably tell our listeners a little bit about who Cicero and Sallust were. And of course, supposedly the two didn't really get along very much. There's this sort of, I don't think it's genuine, but there's a sort of famous invective directed at Cicero by Sallust, or by the so-called pseudo Sallust. What drew you to them, and tell us a little bit about who they were, or what they mean to you.
Yes, a very, very good point, Dr. Bonner, that you made. Caius Sallustius Crispus, or Sallust, as he's known to the English-speaking world, he was one of the, most scholars consider him the first of the great Roman historians. He was a partisan of Caesar, and in fact, he was appointed to a position of responsibility, and apparently enriched himself in northern Africa, and some of those riches he later contributed to the good of the Republic with his gardens. The Gardens of Sallust was a well-known spot in ancient Rome, which I think even survives to this, remnants of it survive even to this day.
Yeah.
Cicero, as many people know, most people have heard the name, they might not know exactly, but he was a politician, a philosopher, a composer of various orations and philosophical treatises. In many ways, arguably one of the most influential writers in the Western tradition.
Yeah.
And what drew me to these works was a number of things. The first with Sallust was the incredible moral power and the compelling narrative force of his monographs. His works, the only complete works of his, as you know, that survive are his historical monographs, the Conspiracy of Catiline and the War of Jugurtha. There are considerable fragments of his general history of his times, which have been compiled and collected, but they're not really forming a coherent whole.
Yeah.
But Sallust's great contributions to Roman historiography were his conscious imitation of Thucydides, his very dense style, and to me, anyway, the truly compelling moral power of his narrative and his concern for virtue, and even though, and we find this often in history, even though he himself may not have measured up to all the ideals that he stood for, there was at least an attempt to impose a normative standard, which I think influenced a lot of narrative historiography for centuries after him. Cornelius Nepos, another author who I delved into. I thought his works would be useful for the modern reader. They're actually written in a very simple Latin, and they're very short biographical sketches of some famous names from Greek antiquity and even Persian and Phoenician history. And these works used to be mainstays of the school curriculum in the English-speaking world, particularly Britain and Canada, and even in America, up until the early 20th century. And as we all know, and to our great detriment, that is no longer the case. So I thought it would be useful, and it would, I think, help the general level of instruction of students if someone could reintroduce these works in a format and with additions and with notations, explanatory notes and introductions and other similar apparatus that could make them digestible to the modern reader.
I think that's great. I remember Gibbon talks about reading Cornelius Nepos in his autobiography, and he talks about sort of that's where he started, and that he had as you say, a very simple style, which was well suited to beginners. But then he would also he would do his prose composition in that style, right? So he learned to both read and to express himself in that way. And I had a very heavy emphasis on prose composition too, back in the day, but we never went anywhere near Cornelius Nepos, and I don't really know why. It was always Cicero. Cicero is probably a better Latinist all round, and certainly if you want to know how to speak well, he's certainly your man. But I agree with you fundamentally that the style of Sallust is arresting and sort of gripping, very heavily compressed. It makes for great reading, even in translation. Thucydides, not so much. He borrowed a lot of turns of phrase and stuff like that, and certainly a sort of a similar cast of mind, I think. But I actually think he's a much better writer than Thucydides was. I always thought that you either get Thucydides or you don't, and I was amongst those who didn't. So I don't even like reading. People talk about this Thucydides trap all the time, as though there's no other way of looking at the threat of warfare. I mean, I don't really know what that means, but he doesn't make for good writing in Greek or even in English. And although having said that, I actually think that something like Pericles' funeral oration, which does have some, it's obviously a work of lasting importance. It arguably sounds better in English, but maybe people will say, well, maybe I'm a Philistine or something. But I guess on the whole, I think we're in agreement about our taste in Latin prose writers. But your career as a translator, it reminds me of the sort of 19th century pastimes, like Gladstone waking up every day and construing Homer, or people like Richard F. Burton, whom I think you also admire as a sort of omniglot, translator of everything, right? Burton has done everything from Catullus to, the Kama Sutra, the Arabian Nights, famously. And of course, sorry, was that?
The Perfumed Garden, I think, that famous Persian, even Hafid and the Persian poet, which obviously you would know much more about than I would. But the Perfumed Garden, I think that's a Persian, the famous erotic poem, which I've never read, but I've heard that was one of his last works, I think. That
I think he's a very interesting man too. I mean, I was always drawn, for people who don't know, Richard F. Burton, he's not the Hollywood actor. He was the guy who discovered the source of the Nile with his friend John Henning Speke. They eventually fell out. We should come back to the contrast between those two guys. I think it's interesting. But he's also, he was in the British Foreign Service at some point, although not all throughout his life. He was in the Indian Army.
Right.
He was commissioned, I believe, to do some kind of investigative work of brothels somewhere in India, and he was accused of having, a little too much intimate knowledge of the brothel.
Right.
Some people say he was a Sufi, an Islamic mystic or something. Who really knows? And he was famously kicked out of Trinity College, Oxford, for insubordination or something or other, and he protested by driving a wagon over the garden, the front garden, while blowing a trumpet, I think. Very interesting guy. And he went on the Meccan pilgrimage in disguise.
Yeah, that's right.
In disguise as a Pashtun or something.
An Afghan doctor, yeah.
So obviously, I was always fascinated by him. And I think, I imagine you are too. This is a spirit of, exploration and sort of curiosity, I think, that is sort of almost dead in our culture. I mean, it's probably fair to say that there's not that much left to explore, but there's still, there are still opportunities for travel and so forth. But, the idea that you would sort of learn 30 languages or something and then just go off and pretend to be a local or disguise yourself, that doesn't really happen. But I imagine he was an inspiration for you too. What do you make of the character of Richard F. Burton?
Oh yeah, well, Burton. I mean, we could discourse, Dr. Bonner, for hours on him. Of course, Burton is in a category all his own. I mean, there's no doubt he was a equal parts rogue and linguistic genius. And like you said, he got his start in the British Army, and he was quickly consumed by what can only be called linguomania.
Mm.
And he proceeded to learn a number of Indian languages, and then from there, just every place he went, he just absorbed. I mean, African languages, Near Eastern languages. He's still a controversial figure in many ways. To backtrack and kind of comment on one of your early, personally, I've always been inspired by the example of this British spirit of the amateur scholar, traveler, kind of a Renaissance man type ethic. And I think that's probably, to a large degree, influenced my own life. So yes, I read a few biographies of Burton, and you're right, the spirit is in many ways dead today, but he still is a controversial figure. There are some biographers and commentators who see him as basically an evil man who, adopted these personas to deceive people while he was on these, not only did he make the Hajj in disguise, but he also visited some cities in Ethiopia. Harar, I think, was one, and I can't remember the name of the other, but some people,
and
yes,
Salt Lake City, and so he went. I don't know if he pretended to be a Mormon, but he went to
Salt Lake. That's right. Right, and some say that was at the behest of the British government as part of an intelligence mission. No one really knows, but these were not inconsiderable feats. These were the eras where if he had been uncovered as an infidel, he would have been lynched without a doubt.
Yeah.
And actually, he was severely wounded in Somalia. When he landed there, he basically ran into a war party, and he received a lance through the jaw, which broke several of his teeth. And I think he stepped on a limpet. He stepped on some sort of sea urchin or something, and had an infected foot.
Yeah.
But in many ways, his talents were wasted in the British Foreign Office. He was posted in Trieste for a number of years. Luckily, he found some marital satisfaction. His wife apparently was a very devout woman, a devout Catholic, who understood his turbulent and complex nature. But he was a driven man. He was a man driven by dark impulses. But by all accounts, he was a gentleman to those who he liked, and he was a holy terror to those whom he did not like. And I think his problem was he did not suffer fools readily, and unfortunately, in government service, that can be a severe detriment to one's career advancement. So, I admire him for his incredible ethnographic work and his linguistic achievements and his translations. But it's a shame that he never, maybe focused his efforts in maybe one or two areas. I think he, in some ways, had too much of a diffuse focus in too many languages, too many regions of the world. It might have been better had he applied himself more rigorously in some specialty area. That's just an opinion of mine.
I agree with that, and you can see that in his footnotes. For instance, you look at his footnotes, it's like, well, there's too much information that hasn't been sort of properly digested, and some of it, actually, in many cases, a lot of it is irrelevant. But he needs to prove. It's as though he needs to prove something, or he feels he has to demonstrate that he's.
Yes, and this is a common pitfall of the amateur, is this tendency to be prolix, to overdo it, to show basically the world that you're a master of the subject matter. All of his books could be probably half the length that they are, and that's exactly the same thing I found. Even like the Book of the Sword was one that I remember having, and it was just filled with just all this, an avalanche of information that really would have been better advised to have been vetted and pruned down to manageable length, I think.
Yeah, well, speaking of which, lots of things have occurred to me as we're discussing. There's what is his name? Doughty. the traveler Doughty.
I've heard the name.
Yeah, he's a similar,
Doughty. Yeah.
yeah, that's right. He's a similar kind of guy, and can't even remember what his famous book was called. It's a travel account where it's Arabian Sands, I think.
Oh, that's Wilfred Thesiger, I think, right?
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. Who's also a great guy. He's
Yeah.
much more manageable than Burton. I like him a lot.
So Doughty is even worse because Doughty, he writes in this a completely unidiomatic form of English.
Yeah.
That is just sort of wild and weird, even by Victorian standards, and it's as though he's trying to make 19th century English have the rhythms and the structure of Arabic.
Yeah.
And he took his book round to different publishers, and they all like, this isn't even proper English. But then it finally got published. I feel that Burton is almost in the same, like those two are sort of almost in the same kind of category. But the work of the amateur, as you say, I mean, there's a sense in which that spirit continued into the 19th century with people like Burton, but it's also, I mean, the great age of the amateur is really the 18th century, and the name that always comes to mind for me is Gibbon.
Yes,
Gibbon was another guy who was thrown out of Oxford, just like Burton, and you can imagine this guy sort of reading all of his stuff on his own, and he amassed a sort of huge personal library. And The Decline and Fall is still a classic, even though people might not turn to it for heavy going his historiography. But that the idea that only university people can write proper history is obviously it's obviously wrong. But I think of modern people like Tom Holland, who I think is a great author, great sense of the past in many sort of different eras. If there are others like him, it's really hard to say, but there can't be many.
Well, these are great points, Dr. Bonner. I'm a big fan of Edward Gibbon. You're right. We don't, even though his volumes were written in the 1770s, it's surprising how much he got right, and that even is valid even today. But we primarily read him today for the just that wonderful stylistic.
Yes.
I mean, if you want to, in my view anyway, if you want to learn English prose, Gibbon to me is the gold standard.
I agree.
I mean, it's wonderfully Latin-esque. It's compact. He's got these very balanced clauses. But it occurred to me there's another one of these in the tradition of the great British amateur scholars that I very much like. This Sir Thomas Heath.
Yes.
You may have heard of him, and he wrote a number of poems on Greek mathematics. And if I remember right, he was a government employee. He worked, I think, in the patent office or the tax office.
Right.
In his spare time, he just loved. He had a mathematical bent, and he had a background in Greek, and he wrote these very wonderful books on the history of Greek mathematics in a very systematic way with diagrams, and I found them just wonderful books, because the reality is the professional scholar who's at and I think the amateur scholar fulfills a very critical function. The professional scholar who is, say, at a university doesn't really have the time or the inclination to I know this because my father was a scientist. He was a professor of cell biology, biochemistry. So he was not a humanities guy like me, but I do know that the focus at universities is very much about professional publishing, and very often there are requirements that you have to adhere to, and there are certain there's just a lot of work and there really isn't the time to reach out to the the general reader. It's not that they don't want to, they just don't really have the time. So I think that's why I think the enthusiast or the amateur scholar can fill a niche that is very important, because it helps it helps interest the general public in these areas.
Yeah.
That way, when they go to the universities, they can, hear more from the instructors there. It basically helps. It's part of the intellectual ecosystem, if we can say it that way.
Yeah, so this presupposes the fundamental importance of history too. History, not just as a discipline, but also as, I'm not sure how we would describe it, almost like an outlook or an historical disposition or attitude that we wish to cultivate in the public. I'm sure it's safe to say that you agree that history is important. What do you think it means, though, to have a properly historical outlook, or to be sort of orientated in history? What does that mean to you?
Well, I think the prerequisite is that the person, or those who wish to be historically grounded, they need to be aware of history. It really that's really a prerequisite. They have to either read on their own, or they have to be taught. And there really is no substitute. It's not something that you can intuit. You have to be aware of where we sit on the timeline of historical consciousness.
Yeah.
I mean, recorded history maybe only goes back to maybe 5,000 years. I'm not sure. I guess depending on, we want to probe the severity, the longevity of recorded history, but people need to have it in one way or another. They need to either be taught it, or they need to be encouraged to read it on their own, or come from environments where it's encouraged. And you can only do that by reading. Mm-hmm. Unfortunately, it's not taught. At least in America, the public school systems have done such a disappointing job, in my view, of preparing young people for the world and for a sense of historical. I mean, it goes without saying, just the abysmal level of historical knowledge. People don't even know the 20th century, never mind the 16th, 17th, 18th. I mean, it's shocking, and I don't know why it's so. I really don't know why it's, because to me, a lot of this stuff does not take a rocket scientist, as the saying goes. This is not hard to grasp. I mean, it just takes an inclination, and a man or a woman without a sense of history is literally blind in the world.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, there's a kind of prevailing mood that history doesn't matter, or that the past has no significance, or that we've somehow reached a stage of development wherein the past just has nothing to tell us. I think that a lot of people, for understandable reasons, but not for very good ones, would have found reason. There would have been a good reason to think like that after the two world wars, but I don't think it was a good one. But of course, it all went haywire again at the end of the Cold War. In the West, people decided that the sort of caricature of the Fukuyama thesis, that everything was over. And of course, if your whole life is tied to computers, or you live in a kind of globalized world where it's just sort of, you get on a plane in one downtown area and then you arrive in another downtown area somewhere else, and they're kind of roughly the same, and there's this kind of unitary global culture. You could easily persuade yourself that nothing that happened before mattered. And I still think that is roughly the way a lot of people think. But of course, we've now lived through a plague, as our ancestors did. There's a huge war again. or a war that kind of threatened. I mean, there's always been war everywhere, right? But this one in Eastern Europe now makes the news, round the clock. There's that kind of anxiety once again that, something new might happen and it might be bad, or that we might go back to something old that was bad. But, and of course, I still remember in the Obama years, you had John Kerry, who I think is an imbecile, but you have John Kerry, lecturing the Russians at the United Nations about how something that they did belonged in the 19th century. It's like, okay, well, I mean, that's not why it's bad. Like the seizure of Crimea has, like, it doesn't matter what century that it happens in,
Right.
But the fact that it's old, the fact that it reminds you of something old, that's not the reason why it's bad. But anyway, I don't know if I really have a question buried in all this, but it's sort of like a constant complaint from me, that I feel that the way people look at the past is sort of like discombobulated. It's sort of there's sort of a confusion about it, and you get it sort of on both sides, that there are also people who want to go back to, or in their minds go back to something that is really a fantasy. And the idea that things, I won't deny it, there are things that were probably a lot better in some ways in, say, 1950s America, where there was a public moral consensus, which may not have been very much respected all the time, but at least there was something approaching a consensus about it. I'll give them that. But the idea that there were no problems before then and that everything went wrong after that, that's obviously, to my mind, that's like clearly implausible. What do you think has, like, I mean, I mentioned the wars and everything. What do you think produces this kind of like anti-historical vision?
Well, these are the questions that trouble me, and I think the best answer to that is, I think it comes down to, Dr. Bonner, it comes down to education and background. We have spent many, many decades now. There was a time, and you can see it if you look at old books from university textbooks from, say, the 1900s. There was a time when not just a classical education, but thorough education in literature and the arts and music was part of the standard program that even, say, physicists or chemists had to imbibe. And now all of that has been abandoned, and we're paying a very, very high price for frankly, our arrogance of thinking that, and this comment of, John Kerry or others like him, it really comes down to arrogance. There's an abysmal level of knowledge about the past, and like you said, we have to also avoid the tendency to try to glorify or glamorize the past, or because in many ways modern society has made achievements that are not inconsiderable and that we cannot ignore. But on the other hand, modern man and woman seems very amputated from their historical traditions and their cultural traditions. And you've touched on this in your work, your book, about why the past is worth preserving, or why we have to sort of maybe recondition people about what it means to be part of Western civilization. Because if you amputate that part from the consciousness of the people, there's sort of a collective insanity that ensues. And I think that's what we're seeing now. And I think I can't remember the historian, but I remember some historian made a very apt observation that a culture that breaks too abruptly with its past can go insane. Just like a person who suddenly loses his memory or her memory suffers from amnesia or some sort of mental lapse, can become irrational, and that's, I think, where we're at right now.
Yeah,
And
my vision of the insanity that comes from the break with the past, I feel as though I could have emphasized it even more, but that the principal symptoms of that, I believe, are fascism, Nazism, and Bolshevism. That the 20th century, that break came in the 20th century, and that those forces were sort of really quite immediate reactions to it. And the idea was, the past is over, it doesn't matter, and we're going to sort of throw ourselves, further forward and faster. And hence you can find the sort of common origin of those ideologies in futurism, which futurism as an art movement or whatever, that's extinct as far as I know. I don't think there are any futurists are, but the idea that somehow the future is where some kind of utopia takes shape, I think is very much contrary to human experience. Our ancestors would have thought of the past as being sure, certain. It was a place where we found meaning and common identity and so forth. The future was uncertain. It was frightening. It was fundamentally unknowable. And there was really, most of the time, there was no good reason to think that it would necessarily be better than anything that came before. And our pathology, for at least the last 100 years, maybe more, is to assume that it must be better, that there's a law of history, progress, and so forth. And if there's any kind of bright side, maybe, I would say, people are sort of finally ready to get rid of that idea. I'm all in favor of having good things happen, good things happen to us as a species as we move forward in time. That's what I want. But the idea that it's inevitable is not a good idea.
Yeah. There's no doubt, Dr. Bonner, that these political movements from the extreme right and the extreme left have done incalculable damage to, the scholarly consensus. I think in the early 20th century, the traumas of the First World War and Second World War have just, it's just, Europe's consciousness was basically shattered into 1,000 pieces, and in many ways we really haven't recovered fully from that.
And what do you?
I don't know what the answer is. I really don't. I mean, all kind of like you, I see myself as a traditionalist, but with progressive inclinations. I mean, I think we have to preserve strong links to the past, but at the same time we have to be alert and willing to adapt to modern conditions. And I think that type of reasonableness is really in short supply these days. You don't see this sort of depth of understanding among political figures or even literary figures, really.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with that. I think it's sad. And what comes to mind is that, in the early 2000s, when the great fear was sort of, I don't know what they called it. Like, I think Christopher Hitchens called it Islamofascism, or terror, Islamic or Islamist terrorism.
Right.
Leaving aside all of the sort of politically charged rhetoric, a lot of people would confront this and they would say, well, this is fundamentally medieval. But it's not. I can assure you, if there were some kind of medieval revivalist movement, it would look really quite different. Like, medieval people didn't fly airplanes. They didn't sit there in bunkers with videotapes. This is completely different, and it is something that only the modern world could have produced. And in many ways, you could argue that a greater sense of, I don't know, intellectual, what's the word? Intellectual openness, or sort of like greater intellectual freedom in some ways, like not all, but in some ways, prevailed in what we call the Middle Ages than what we now have. And you can't imagine someone like like a modern day Aquinas, someone who's quoting pagan authors, and Muslim, Jewish writers, and who's very much steeped in a Aristotelian, pagan tradition. This, maybe there can only ever be one Thomas Aquinas, but that spirit is doesn't seem to be with us now. But there's certainly, I would like to think that there are people who might be able to take something from it, or sort of revive that sense. But the prejudice against the past, and still using phrases like medieval as a slur or whatever, that kind of thing is always going to stand in the way. But we're almost out of time. I very much enjoyed our discussion.
As did I. Thank you, Dr.
For the inaugural podcast. I hope we've begun, with good omens. Anything else you'd like to mention before we sign off?
Dr. Barno, I think these are these questions are. I'm glad to hear that there are, others out there that wrestle with these problems of society and ideas the same way that maybe I do and others do. And I think the only real solution is to keep asking the questions and keep discussing them. And people will say, well, what's the book? Well, this is how things get solved. You have to have a discourse. There has to be, there's a reason why the philosophical dialogue has endured as the primary method of philosophical inquiry, because only by batting the tennis ball around the court can we really see where we are and arrive at some kind of enlightenment. So I thank you for that opportunity. I look forward to speaking to you again anytime.
It's a pleasure. Now, listeners and watchers, you can order the translations of Quintus, Curtius on Amazon. I encourage you all to do so. I've got the Sallust translation, and I've enjoyed it immensely. And it's not just a translation; there's also learned notes and commentaries. So make sure you do that. And
thank you, sir.
We will see you all next time. Thanks for coming on.
Thank you, Dr. Bonner. You have a good week.
All the best. Bye.